German tank engineering during the Second World War held a leading position. By the end of the war, it ranked second overall, though in some aspects the Germans were unmatched. For example, among medium tanks, the best, if one considers all characteristics together, was the Panther. While the Soviet T-34 and the American M4 Sherman had advantages due to their mass production and upgrade potential, the Panther was potentially superior in armor protection and armament, and it was also quite mobile. This tank was intended to become the mainstay of the German army, and this goal was partly achieved. In the second half of 1944, the Panther became the most widespread German tank on the front. It was produced by 3 factories, and in peak months during the summer of 1944, more than 350 tanks were manufactured monthly. All of Germany's armored production prospects were tied to the Panther. By the second half of 1945, the plan was to keep only this medium tank and its derivatives in production. Moreover, there were plans to continue improving the model. The standard tank was to become the Panther variant with a new turret, offering more reliable frontal armor protection. At the same time, there is a common misconception that the appearance of the Panther led to a complete halt or sharp reduction in the production of other medium tanks, after which the Panther quickly became the main German tank. In reality, during the period when Panther production reached its peak, the production of another medium tank, the Panzer IV, also peaked. The difference in output was not that large, even though by the summer of 1944, the Panzer IV was being produced by only one factory. As for medium self-propelled artillery vehicles, there is little to add. Among combat vehicles based on the Panzer IV chassis, only the assault guns Stug and Stuch were produced in larger numbers. And this is despite the fact that the Panzer IV chassis had officially been considered obsolete since early 1944. Such facts might seem paradoxical, but only at first glance. There were several reasons why the Panzer IV, whose production had begun back in November 1937, remained in service for so long, and why the Germans continued to manufacture 2 types of tanks simultaneously throughout the war. This is precisely what we will discuss in this traditionally extensive analysis. To begin with, it is worth explaining how it happened that by the autumn of 1939, the German army found itself with 2 medium tanks at once. In this regard, the Germans were not alone, though their reasons were different. The British, at the beginning of 1940, had 3 medium tanks in serial production, but that was because they originally belonged to different types. Later, there were pairs such as the Crusader and Covenanter, as well as the Centaur and Cromwell. But even in those cases, the reasons differed. The tanks were essentially of the same class but had different chassis and often simply different engines. The existence of 2 types of medium tanks in France was explained by other reasons. One was intended for infantry and the other for cavalry. And officially, it was even classified as an armored fighting vehicle. As for the Germans, they arrived at a similar situation somewhat unexpectedly, even for themselves, partly under the influence of the British tank design school. Initially, the German army planned to create 2 types of tanks, a medium one called Großtraktor, weighing about 16 tons, armed with a short 75mm gun, capable of reaching a speed of roughly 25 miles per hour and able to float, and a light one called Kleintraktor, with a crew of 2, a 37mm gun, and the same top speed of 25 miles per hour. The latter soon evolved into the Leichttraktor. Its weight first increased to 6 tons and eventually reached 8 tons. The crew expanded to 4 people, though in practice there were 5. But the turret was too cramped to fit 3. Both vehicles proved unsuccessful, and later the Großtraktor evolved into a medium tank called NBFs. The initial plan specified a weight of 18 tons, but the actual figure turned out to be 23 tons. The attempt to create a domestic analog of the British medium tank Mk3 was not particularly successful. It is important to note that during this period, the large tanks were considered the main ones, yet things consistently went off track. By the mid-30s, the situation looked like this. The second version of the Kleintraktor became the Ley S, a light infantry support tank. Initially, it was intended to have a crew of 3 and be armed with a 20mm automatic cannon, but that did not work out. Therefore, the Ley S, also known as Pez KPFW1, had a crew of 2 and was armed only with twin MG-13 machine guns. Realizing that something had gone wrong, the 6th Department of the Armament Directorate ordered another light tank, the Ley S-100. According to test results, the design by MAN turned out to be the best, and thus the P's KPFW-2 appeared. As a result, the Germans ended up with 2 light tanks, one larger and one smaller. The situation with medium tanks was no less ironic. The Leichttraktor evolved into the ZW, short for Zugführerwagen, meaning platoon commander's vehicle, a medium tank of the 10-ton category, which quickly increased to 12 tons, and the experimental prototypes already weighed 15 tons. As for the NBFs, its fate was finally decided in February 1935. The Rheinmetall-Borsig Company, the original developer, received a contract to produce the Verbesserten NBFs, that is, an improved version of the tank, essentially a new vehicle. The technical requirements remained the same as for the NBFZ, 17 to 18 tons of weight. But now it carried only a single short-barreled 75mm gun, about 3 inches in caliber. In essence, this weapon's anti-tank capabilities were close to those of the 37mm gun, with only a small difference in armor penetration. However, this new tank was no longer considered main. The role of the principal medium tank was now assigned to the ZW, while the purpose of the Verbesserten NBFs became clear from its new index, introduced back in the autumn of 1934, BW, short for Begleitwagen, or support vehicle. Essentially, the machine turned into an artillery tank. The British had developed such vehicles as early as the 1920s, and from the early 1930s, similar efforts were made in the Soviet Union. Yet in both Britain and the USSR, these tanks were built on the chassis of their main battle tanks, while the Germans ended up creating 2 distinct designs, which before long became very similar to each other. The situation around this specialized machine was becoming increasingly strange. The contract for manufacturing the tank's turret was won by the Krupp concern. However, this huge weapons producer from the city of Essen managed to convince the higher command that it could build the entire tank itself. And Krupp did surprise everyone. The tank it built turned out to be the only one that met the original weight requirements. It was soon discovered that this machine clearly outperformed its competitor from Rheinmetall, which led to the signing, in December 1936, of a contract for the production of 35 tanks designated Panzerkampfwagen IV, Modification A. A year later, the Großtraktor plant delivered the first tanks, and a new contract was signed for the production of 42 tanks of the second series. At that point, the production of the 4th Panzers could have ended. On the 1st of June 1937, Krupp received a letter from Heinrich Kniepkamp, who was responsible in the 6th Department of the Armaments Directorate for tank chassis development. Around that time, work began on a new version of the tank, which received the designation Panzerkampfwagen III, Modification E. Initially, things were going poorly for this tank. The first versions were produced in trial batches, and there were serious problems with the running gear. As for the new version, it followed Kniepkamp's idea of a high-speed tank. It was expected to reach a speed of about 43 miles per hour, featuring a fundamentally different suspension system with torsion bars developed by the Porsche company. The plan was for this new chassis to be unified for both the 3rd and 4th Panzers. The idea made sense, since having 2 almost identical tanks was an abnormal situation. But serious problems arose along the way. The saying, "If you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans," didn't come from nowhere. And that was exactly what happened with the new tank. Development dragged on, and Krupp began to clash with the 6th Department of the Armaments Directorate as early as the summer of 1937. The Armaments Office took Krupp's side. There were clever people there who saw that Krupp already had a suitable tank, while Daimler-Benz did not. So on the 27th of June 1937, they made it clear that the 2nd series would not be the last order. In October 1937, a contract was signed for 140 tanks of the 3rd series, the Panzerkampfwagen IV, Modification C. Meanwhile, the Großtraktor plant continued to deliver tanks steadily, which, unlike the early 3rd Panzers, did not cause headaches. These turned out to be quite successful machines, and by October 1938, all tanks of the first 2 modifications had been completed. But the situation with the new version of the 3rd Panzer was poor. The tank reached trials only in the spring of 1938, and it immediately failed to run properly, forcing a series of design changes. That was when Krupp struck back. In early May 1938, Erich Wolfert, Krupp's chief engineer, raised a number of uncomfortable questions about the prospects of producing a unified tank. As a result, the idea of a single tank had to be abandoned for a while. In July 1938, Krupp received a contract for the production of 200 more tanks, the 4th series, Modification D, while the troubles with the new version of the 3rd Panzer continued. Only at the end of that year was the tank, now designated Panzerkampfwagen III Modification E, finally launched into series production. Because of this, the 6th Department of the Armaments Directorate failed its plan to produce a main tank. By the end of 1940, it was expected that the German army would have 2,995 tanks of the Panzer III family, but in fact, during the entire 1939, only 286 such machines were completed. By the beginning of the Second World War, there were 98 3rd Panzers in the army, 87 of them in active units. For comparison, in the same year, 1939, 147 specialized 4th Panzers were produced. And by the 1st of September 1939, there were 211 of them, 197 of which were in active service. In the Soviet Union, for far less than that, a person would have been sent to cut timber at best. But Kniepkamp suffered no consequences at all. Yes, a tank commission was formed under Ferdinand Porsche, but so what? He remained in charge of the chassis just as before. To bring the 3rd model tank to operational condition took a full year. The promised nearly 3,000 such tanks never appeared by the end of the year, but at least 862 vehicles were produced during 1940. The production of the 4th model tanks was limited, 290 units in 1940. Yet there were no large-scale orders for it, as this was a specialized machine built for specific tasks. The fact that this very tank was considered the best among the troops went largely unnoticed. It should be said that even abroad, greater attention was paid to the 3rd model, while the 4th was generally regarded as a secondary vehicle. For example, in the Soviet Union, they did not even conduct driving tests on captured 4th model tanks. In reality, however, it remained a dark horse. Until a certain point, few noticed that improvements to the running gear as the tank's mass increased were carried out only to a minimal extent. This was particularly evident compared to the significant changes made to the running gear of the 3rd model. All attention was focused on the favorite creation of engineer Kniepkamp. At the same time, programs were launched for potential replacements of the 3rd model, a series of tanks in the 20-ton class. And even there, Kniepkamp managed to impose his will. The company Krupp suffered especially, as from the 15th of September 1939, it had been working on a potential replacement for the 4th model. The design was to have 6 road wheels of increased diameter, up to 25 inches, with the same block suspension. The project was terminated on the 16th of May 1940, and it was then made clear that the project would be buried for the second time. In the end, out of all the potential replacements, only one 20-ton class tank from Daimler-Benz reached the stage of a built prototype. One made, as they said, without caring for Kniepkamp's opinion. This meant a diesel engine and a spring suspension. The realization of the full depth of the problem came only at the end of 1941 and the beginning of 1942. First, in late December 1941, work on promising 20-ton class tanks was abandoned, and the weight limit rose to 30 tons. In fact, the technical specification called for 35 tons. Second, the attempt to create a modified 3rd model, equipped with the turret from the 4th model and a 75mm gun, with a barrel length of 43 calibers, failed. It became clear that the load limit of the running gear had been reached, and in this particular case, even exceeded. At that point, the story of the 3rd model could safely be closed. The 4th model, on the other hand, could easily carry this gun. The situation had turned truly absurd. The machine that engineers had tried to sink for so many years became a lifesaver. Initially, however, it was assumed that 30-ton class tanks would appear quickly and the 3rd model could serve for the time being. Therefore, the sharp increase in production of the 4th model occurred only at the end of 1942. In November, 113 vehicles were delivered, in December 155, and production volumes continued to rise afterward. Another factor was that by autumn 1942, modernization reserves for the 4th model were nearly exhausted. As a result, the frontal armor of the hull and turret box was strengthened to 3.1 inches, while the turret front remained 2 inches thick. Thus, the new year, 1943, found the German tank industry with 3 medium tanks, the third model living out its last days on the production line, the fourth model becoming the main star but already at the end of its development potential, and the Panther, which was supposedly created to be the main medium tank, a title it still had to earn on the assembly line. In January 1943, the German MAN factory produced the first 4 Panther tanks of the D model. At that time, this vehicle was considered the best medium tank in the world. In terms of speed, the Panther was not inferior to the Soviet T-34, yet it significantly surpassed it in both armament and frontal armor thickness. Another important advantage was that the tank turned out to be very efficient to manufacture. For comparison, the cost of the previous German tank model without armament was 103,462 Reichsmarks, while the Panther cost 117,100 Reichsmarks, and this despite being a much larger vehicle. Thanks to its production simplicity, output was later increased to over 300 tanks per month starting in April 1944. It would seem that under such conditions, the Panther should have quickly replaced the earlier model, since both vehicles essentially occupied the same niche. There was no longer a division into main medium and support tank. Instead, there were 2 main medium tanks, with the older model losing to the new one in every aspect. But reality turned out differently. During 1943, 1,777 Panther tanks were produced, while as many as 3,072 tanks of the old model rolled off the lines. So when someone claims that the Panther replaced other German medium tanks in service, it can only bring a knowing smile. This situation seems surprising only at first glance. Let's take a closer look at what was actually happening with the Panther. No one denies that the tank was an outstanding design. The real question is, what exactly did the Germans create? Initially, the specification called for a combat vehicle weighing 35 tons, about 77,000 pounds, with a power-to-weight ratio of 20 horsepower per ton, and a top speed of around 37 miles per hour. In other words, Herr Kneipkamp had not given up on his racing tank concept. A 700 horsepower Maybach engine was already available, a design that had been under development since 1937. Its height was nearly 47 inches. For comparison, the height of the Soviet Vi-2 engine was 42 inches, and the previous German engine only 32 inches. Inside, the torsion bars also took up additional vertical space. As a result, the prototype's hull height reached 54 inches, not counting the 20 inches of ground clearance. Furthermore, the turret was shifted closer to the center of gravity. For context, the total hull height of the T-34 was 50 inches, with the height to the roof of the fighting compartment being 45 inches. Interestingly, the competing tank that lost the design contest had a hull just as tall as the Panther. From the very beginning, both German tanks weighed noticeably more than the officially stated 35 tons. Then came the requirement to increase the frontal armor thickness from 60 to 80 millimeters, from 2.4 to 3.1 inches. As a result, we do not know the exact weight of the Panther prototype, but the production model came out weighing 45 tons, 99,000 pounds. Yet the running gear had been designed only for 35 tons. The result of all this was that the Panther initially had no reserve for future development. Moreover, the start of its operational use turned into a string of epic breakdowns. The most striking incident occurred during a demonstration on February 21, 1943, when 6 out of 13 participating tanks broke down. From February to April 1943, factories were busy debugging the vehicle. In practice, the tanks were only delivered in May 1943, 324 units at once, with 200 of them sent directly to the Kursk salient. There, a series of astonishing events unfolded. A particularly telling case occurred on the evening of July 7, 1943, when the 10th Tank Brigade had only 7 operational vehicles left. Later, the number of combat-ready Panthers fluctuated between 25 and 45 tanks. As a result, the order for 1,000 Panther D tanks was reduced to 850, and from July 1943 onward, production of the Panther A model began. The Panther had more than its share of problems. The road wheels often broke down, the final drives were unreliable, but the biggest headache was the Maybach engine. This power unit used a set of 4 Solex carburetors whose operation caused trouble throughout the entire war. The issue was never fully solved. It's no coincidence that the newer version of the Maybach engine was planned to feature direct fuel injection. The main goal of that decision was to increase reliability, with the added horsepower being a pleasant bonus. By the end of 1943, the reliability of the Panther had improved. It could now cover about 621 miles. Yet a number of its illnesses remained. Even without considering minor details like the poor side visibility, the overall picture was far from encouraging. Against this background, it's not surprising that production of the Panzer IV continued to grow. In March 1943, 205 tanks were completed. By May, the number had risen to 272, and by the end of the year, monthly output exceeded 300 vehicles. Yet this tank had been targeted for replacement at least twice. In June 1943, Heinz Guderian, then Inspector General of the Panzer Troops, initiated the development of a multi-purpose vehicle. Essentially, it was an attempt to replace the old chassis with a more modern one, featuring a stronger engine and, more importantly, an improved suspension. But in October 1943, the project was halted. Later came the so-called Third-Fourth model, a simplified and cheaper version that also included suspension upgrades. However, this tank lacked full turret rotation, its horizontal traverse being limited to 270 degrees. Ultimately, this project, launched on the 4th of January 1944, was cancelled in July of the same year. A similar story followed with Krupp's proposal from November 1944, which suggested mounting a new turret with a 75mm gun on the Panzer IV chassis. But this concept had already been rejected back in late 1942 due to the chassis' lack of structural reserves. The entire situation surrounding potential upgrades of the Panzer IV evokes nothing but astonishment. Krupp had the means to modernize the suspension, building upon earlier design experience, but this opportunity was initially dismissed under the assumption that the tank would soon be replaced anyway. When the crisis struck, it turned out there was no longer time for such reworking. The production lines were already running at full capacity. For this reason, the 9th series was abandoned in its original form. Meanwhile, opportunities for redesigning the suspension did exist, and they wouldn't have required significant changes to the hull. Thanks to the block suspension and the mounting configuration of the idlers and drive sprockets, the Germans could have achieved modernization on par with the American medium tank Sherman, which used a horizontal spring suspension. Ironically, the Americans had taken care of this issue as early as the spring of 1942, and their result was an optimal modernization. The Germans, however, failed to do the same, even though the problem had been evident since the first half of 1942. After that, the Germans faced the reality that the tank could not be further improved without overloading it. As a result, by the summer of 1944, Panzer IVs had effectively become cannon fodder. Around this time, the Allied forces began fielding large numbers of Sherman tanks armed with 76mm guns, as well as the T-34-85. The Germans could no longer achieve a similar modernization, and despite several attempts, they never retooled the Nibelungenwerk, the sole producer of the Panzer IV since June 1944, to manufacture Panthers. The Austrians continued producing Panzer IVs like hotcakes, plugging the gaps in units that were losing tanks faster than new ones could be delivered.